Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Night Sleep. If you're new here, we're all about bringing you those spine-tingling, edge-of-your-seat stories to help you unwind and drift off into a world of suspense and thrill. I know how hard it can be to get some rest, especially with so many distractions around. That's why we're here to make sure your night is filled with a mix of fun, relaxation, and a touch of excitement. Before we dive into tonight's chilling story, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready for some thrilling entertainment. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss out on our latest uploads. We'd love to hear from you, so drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Are you curled up in bed or perhaps winding down after a long day? All right, grab your favorite blanket, get comfortable, and let's get started with tonight's story. You're in for a treat, so relax and enjoy. As a long-haul trucker, I've seen my fair share of eerie things on the road, but nothing compared to the night I drove through Dead Man's Pass. For most truckers, this route is just a stretch of highway cutting through the Rocky Mountains, isolated and winding, where the cliffsides loom over you like silent sentinels. It's a place known for bad weather, unpredictable road conditions, and tragically, for the number of fatal accidents that have occurred over the years. But no one ever warned me about the other dangers lurking on that road. It was mid-December, and I had just left Denver, hauling a load of machinery to Seattle. A snowstorm had hit the Rockies earlier in the day, leaving the roads slick and treacherous. The storm had passed, but the thick blanket of snow left behind reflected the glow of my headlights, making the mountain pass seem even more desolate. By the time I reached Dead Man's Pass, it was close to midnight. The narrow road twisted and turned as my rig crawled along, the tires occasionally slipping on patches of black ice. I was alone, the only vehicle on the road for miles. The radio was off, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the steady whoosh of the wind outside. I was already tense from the road conditions, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure, standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, wearing a long, tattered coat, her face obscured by a hood. She was standing still, almost unnaturally so, as if she had been waiting there for hours. In the brief flash of my headlights, I could see her hand slowly rise, her thumb out, asking for a ride. My first instinct was to keep driving. Dead Man's Pass was notorious for accidents, and I couldn't afford any distractions, let alone picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere. But something about her gave me pause. She looked so out of place, so fragile against the cold and snow. I hesitated, but eventually pulled over a few yards ahead of where she stood. I kept the engine running, my eyes glued to the side mirror, waiting for her to approach the truck. For a few long moments, nothing happened. Then slowly, she started walking toward the rig, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step was an effort. When she reached the door, I rolled down the window just a crack. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice echoing awkwardly in the cold air. She nodded, but still didn't say a word. Her face was hidden in the shadows of her hood, and something about her silence unnerved me. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, but I couldn't just leave her out there in the middle of a freezing mountain pass. "All right, hop in," I said reluctantly, unlocking the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, pulling the door shut behind her. The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop immediately. I shivered and adjusted the heater, but the warmth that had been building in the truck suddenly felt weak, like it couldn't keep up with the cold she'd brought in with her. For the first few minutes, we drove in complete silence. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I glanced over at her, trying to get a better look at her face, but all I could make out were the pale features beneath her hood. Thin lips, hollow cheeks, and eyes that seemed sunken as if she hadn't slept in days. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent in the dim light. "You okay?" I asked, trying to hide the unease in my voice. Finally, she turned her head to look at me, and the sight of her eyes made my blood run cold. They weren't just dark. They were empty, hollow, as if there was nothing behind them. No life. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Where are you headed?" I asked again, more out of a desperate need to break the silence than anything else. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed ahead, down the road, where the mountain pass curved sharply around a cliffside. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. As we approached the curve, the wind picked up, howling through the mountains like a banshee. The road narrowed, and the drop-off on the side of the cliff became more pronounced, the guardrail barely visible in the swirling snow. Out of nowhere she spoke. "Slow down," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I glanced at the speedometer. I wasn't going fast, barely 30 miles per hour. "I'm already going slow," I said, my voice trembling. "Slower," she insisted, her tone more urgent this time. I eased off the gas, the truck slowing to a crawl as we approached the curve. The wind was howling now, rattling the windows and shaking the cab. I could barely see a few feet in front of me through the snow. Then, just as we rounded the bend, my headlights caught something in the road. An overturned car, its roof crushed and its windows shattered, lying just ahead. If I hadn't slowed down, I would have plowed right into it. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the ice, but coming to a stop just inches from the wreck. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the twisted metal, trying to process what had just happened. "How did you know?" I asked, turning to look at the woman. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked, and the window hadn't been opened. She had vanished without a trace. I sat there for a moment, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced. Had I imagined her? Was she a hallucination brought on by the exhaustion and stress of the drive? But then I saw it, a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the truck and disappearing into the darkness beyond the guardrail. I scrambled out of the cab, slipping on the icy road as I followed the tracks. They led to the edge of the cliff, where the guardrail had been smashed as if something or someone had gone over the edge. I peered down into the ravine, my heart in my throat. At the bottom, barely visible through the snow, was another car, rusted, decayed, and half buried in the snowdrifts. It looked like it had been there for years. And then it hit me, the woman, the car, the accident. I'd heard stories from other truckers about Dead Man's Pass, about the accidents that had claimed so many lives over the years. But I'd never believed them. Until now. Shaking, I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. I didn't stop until I was well past the mountain pass, the haunting memory of the woman and the wreck forever etched into my mind. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road, because I know, somewhere out there in the mountains, she's still waiting for the next driver to come along. My name is Jack Mercer, and I've been a trucker for nearly 18 years. The life of a long-haul trucker is filled with lonely nights, barren highways, and the occasional strange encounter. But nothing has ever come close to what I experienced on Highway 47 one cold autumn night, something that still keeps me awake, staring at my ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. It was a Tuesday night in late November, just before Thanksgiving, and I was hauling a load of lumber from Kansas to Colorado. Highway 47 is one of those roads you only take if you know what you're doing. It's long, isolated, and notorious for having next to no cell service for miles. It's a favorite for truckers because it's a shortcut, but it's also known for something else. Stories. Stories about things people see on that road that aren't supposed to be there. The night was colder than usual, and a thin layer of fog had begun to roll in, wrapping around my rig like a blanket. I wasn't too worried about it. I'd driven through worse weather in my time. The road was empty, as usual, and I was making good time. But as the fog thickened, I noticed something unusual. A pair of headlights far behind me, flickering in and out of the mist. At first, I thought it was another trucker. I didn't think much of it, but the lights seemed off. They were dim, like the kind of headlights you'd see on an old vehicle, something from the 60s or 70s. The fog was getting worse, and the lights behind me disappeared completely. Again, I thought nothing of it, chalking it up to the weather. 20 minutes later, as I was rounding a curve, the headlights appeared again, this time much closer. It was like whoever was behind me had sped up fast, closing the distance in no time. My hands tightened on the wheel. Something felt off. The lights were too low to the ground, like the vehicle was unusually small or old, but they weren't moving naturally. They'd flicker out for a second, then reappear, zigzagging slightly, as if the driver was having trouble controlling the car. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights were gone again. I glanced in my rearview mirror, nothing but thick fog and darkness. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some beat-up car with bad wiring. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on my eyes. but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. About an hour later, I spotted something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man, standing on the shoulder, staring straight at me. He was wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in the shadows of the headlights. My heart raced as I passed him. His eyes followed my truck, unblinking. I glanced in the mirror to see him fade into the fog, but just as I did, I saw the headlights again. Those same flickering, unnatural lights, but now they were right behind me, almost tailgating my rig. There was no sound, no engine noise, nothing. Just those old, flickering lights, hovering way too close for comfort. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. The lights stayed right on my tail, no matter how fast I went. I could feel the panic building in my chest, but I didn't dare stop. I'd heard too many stories from fellow truckers about strange things happening on this stretch of road. People disappearing, and vehicles that don't belong up. I wasn't about to be one of those stories. Suddenly, the lights veered to the left, moving to the side of the road as if they were going to pass me. I glanced out the driver's side window, expecting to see the vehicle, but there was nothing, just the fog and darkness. The lights had vanished into thin air. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fog was thick, but there were no headlights, no sign of the car or whatever it was that had been following me. Just as I was about to start driving again, I saw him, the man from the side of the road. He was standing in front of my truck, just a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine. I froze. His face was pale, gaunt, almost skeletal. He slowly raised his hand, pointing directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. I didn't care what happened next. I just needed to get away from him. As my truck sped forward, I braced for impact, expecting to hit him, but there was nothing. He was gone, just like the lights, just like everything else that had happened that night. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the next town, hours later. When I told the clerk about what had happened, he gave me a knowing look. "You saw the phantom," he said, his voice low. "Happens sometimes on Highway 47. There's no car, no man, just something that follows you. And if you stop, well, let's just say you're lucky you didn't." To this day, I avoid Highway 47. Whatever I saw that night, whatever was following me, I didn't want to meet it again. Being a long-haul trucker is not for the faint of heart. I've driven through thunderstorms, blizzards, and scorching deserts. I've seen things on the road that make me question reality. But none of that compared to what I experienced one night, in the middle of nowhere, on a stretch of highway that for the life of me, I can't find on any map. My name is Carl. I've been trucking for about 22 years now. Mostly night runs. I prefer the quiet, fewer cars, and less hassle. But after what happened last October, I think I'll stick to daylight routes. I had a load to deliver from Texas to Utah, which meant I had to drive through some pretty isolated parts of New Mexico. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on one of those barren stretches of highway where the only thing you can see is the road ahead of you and the occasional distant silhouette of a cactus or a rock formation. The sky was clear, but the moon was barely a sliver, offering little to no light. It was just me, my rig, and the endless road. After hours of driving, fatigue started creeping in. I needed to find a place to rest. I hadn't seen a sign for a rest stop or gas station in miles, but I figured one had to come up soon. And just as I was thinking that, I saw it, a faded, rusted green sign that read "Rest Stop 2 miles." It was like the universe heard my thoughts. 2 miles later, I saw the rest stop pull off. It wasn't much, a couple of picnic tables, an old bathroom building, and a few parking spots. But it was enough. I pulled in, parked my rig, and stepped out. The air was still unnaturally quiet. No wind, no sound of insects, just an eerie stillness that immediately put me on edge. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cab and decided to stretch my legs a bit. The place looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The bathroom building had cracked windows, and graffiti covered the walls. The whole area had a sense of abandonment, like it was forgotten by time. As I walked toward the bathroom, I heard something. A faint noise, like the sound of someone shuffling their feet behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just my truck sitting under the dim glow of an old streetlight that flickered every few seconds. I stood still for a moment listening, but all I could hear was my breathing. I shook my head, chalking it up to the tiredness messing with my senses. I finished stretching and decided to take a quick nap in the cab before hitting the road again. As I climbed back into the truck, I noticed something strange. There was another truck parked a few spaces over. It wasn't there when I pulled in. It was an old, rusted semi, the kind you'd see in a scrapyard, with no trailer attached. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of movement. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it when I pulled in. Yeah, that had to be it. I locked the doors, settled into the seat, and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I was about to drift off, I heard that noise again, the faint shuffling, like someone was moving around outside. I opened my eyes and peered out the window. The other truck was still there, silent, unmoving. I told myself it was probably just the wind or the metal cooling in the night air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned on the truck's interior lights, hoping that would ease my nerves, but it didn't help. The unease was growing stronger. Then I saw it, a figure standing near the other truck. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe another driver, but the longer I stared, the more I realized something was wrong. The figure was too still, too rigid. It was just standing there, facing my truck, watching. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But when I looked again, it was still there, closer now. It hadn't moved, but it was closer than before. My heart started to race. I flicked on the high beams, lighting up the parking lot. The figure was gone. But the other truck, the old rusted one? It was gone too. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. How could an entire semi just disappear? I started the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't care how tired I was anymore. I needed to get out of there. As I pulled out of the rest stop, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the figure again, standing in the middle of the lot, watching me leave. Then it vanished into the darkness. I floored it, speeding down the highway, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 50 miles away. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my mind racing with questions. What the hell had I just seen? Was it a person? A ghost? Something else? I asked the clerk inside about the rest stop back down the highway. He gave me a confused look. "There's no rest stop out there," he said, shaking his head. "Hasn't been one in over 30 years. They shut it down after a trucker was found dead there." Weird story too. Some folks say his truck disappeared the night he died. I left that gas station with a knot in my stomach, my mind buzzing with fear and confusion. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but I've never driven that route again. And I never stop at rest stops in the middle of nowhere. If you're out on the road late at night and you see a rest stop that seems too quiet, too still, keep driving. Some places are better left behind. I've been driving long haul for almost 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing ever shook me quite like what happened one night in the summer of 2018. My name's Roy, I'm 45, and this story still haunts me every time I drive alone at night. I had a delivery route that took me from Arizona to New Mexico, cutting through miles of desolate desert highway. It was a long, lonely stretch of road, and I was driving overnight to make up for some lost time. My rig rumbled along, the headlights illuminating only the empty road ahead and the occasional road sign. The desert landscape seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, and I knew there wouldn't be much in the way of civilization for a good 100 miles or so. It was one of those nights where the sky was clear, but the blackness was overwhelming. The stars were out, but they didn't offer much comfort when you're in the middle of nowhere. I had the radio on low, more for the company than anything else. The hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio were the only sounds keeping me awake. Around 2 a.m., I saw something up ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb up. A hitchhiker. That wasn't too unusual, but it's rare to see someone hitchhiking this far out in the desert, especially at that hour. Something about it gave me a bad feeling, but I slowed down anyway. I wasn't planning to stop, but I wanted to get a better look. As I got closer, my headlights fully illuminated the person. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a worn-out denim jacket and jeans. His face was gaunt, and he had a wild look in his eyes. He was waving frantically now, almost desperate. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories from fellow truckers about bad encounters. But something about this guy's urgency made me reconsider. Maybe he was stranded or in trouble. I pulled the rig over to the side of the road, leaving the engine idling, and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, you need some help?" I called out, my eyes scanning him for any sign of danger. The man ran up to the truck, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights. His eyes were wide with fear and his breathing was ragged. He didn't look like the type who'd been on the road for too long. His clothes were dirty, but not the kind of dirty you get from living on the street. "Please, man, you've got to let me in," he gasped, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Something's out there, something's coming." I felt a chill run down my spine. The way he said it, the sheer terror in his voice, it didn't sound like he was trying to scam me or pull something. It sounded like he genuinely believed he was in danger. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle, weighing my options. Before I could make a decision, the man's face changed. His fear turned to panic. He grabbed the door handle, yanking on it frantically. "Please, it's coming! It's coming! You have to drive! Now!" I looked out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the desert, but I didn't see anything. No headlights, no cars, no movement, just the empty, endless road. "What's coming?" I asked, my voice tense. He didn't answer, just kept pulling on the door, begging me to let him in. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door, and he scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. "Drive," he shouted, looking back out the window, his hands shaking. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I figured I'd drive him to the next gas station or rest stop and let him out there. As we sped down the highway, I glanced over at him. He was breathing heavily, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles were white. After a few minutes of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. "What the hell's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't look at me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" He finally turned to me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's been following me for miles," he said. "I've been on this road for days, trying to get away from it, but it won't stop. It never stops." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What's following you?" He shook his head, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "I don't know what it is. It doesn't have a face, just eyes. It watches you. It watches you until you stop, and then it gets closer." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This guy was either insane or telling the truth, and I wasn't sure which option was worse. "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I haven't seen anything out there. Maybe you're just tired. I can drop you off at the next town and get you some help." He shook his head violently. "No, it's real. You'll see. It's already too late." Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered. My heart skipped a beat as I looked down at the dashboard. The gauges were going haywire, the speedometer needle bouncing wildly. The engine let out a low groan, and then, without warning, the truck died. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the desert now eerily silent. I tried turning the key, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying again, but it was no use. The hitchhiker's breath quickened. "It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's coming." I looked out into the darkness, my heart racing. At first I saw nothing, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something was out there just beyond the edge of the headlights. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its form shifting in the shadows. And then I saw them, two glowing yellow eyes, staring directly at us. The man in the passenger seat let out a strangled sob, curling up into a ball, his hands covering his face. "Don't look at it!" he screamed. "Don't look!" But I couldn't look away. The eyes were locked on me, unblinking, growing closer with each passing second. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the driver's seat, my truck idling on the side of the road. The hitchhiker was gone, and the road was empty, stretching out into the darkness. I never saw the man again, and I never figured out what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. Something is out there on those lonely highways, something that watches and waits. And I'm never stopping for a hitchhiker again. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years now. My name's Jim, and I've driven coast to coast more times than I can count. Late nights, long stretches of highway, and countless lonely hours on the road, none of that ever bothered me. But one night, back in 2017, on a desolate stretch of Route 66, something happened that still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was hauling a load from Los Angeles to Oklahoma City, a route I'd driven plenty of times before. The road was mostly empty, as it tends to be in the middle of the night. The only company I had was the steady hum of my rig and the occasional headlights from a car passing in the opposite direction. That night was particularly dark. There was no moon, and the stars were obscured by thick cloud. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of black, lit only by my truck's headlights. I had a long way to go and a tight deadline to meet, so I kept my foot steady on the gas, my eyes scanning the road ahead. After a few hours, I started to feel that familiar creeping fatigue. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to find a place to pull over soon for a quick rest. I passed through a small town, one of those blink and you'll miss it places, and saw a faded sign for a rest stop about 10 miles ahead. I figured I'd stop there, stretch my legs, maybe catch an hour or two of sleep. As I neared the rest stop, something felt off. The road was eerily silent, and the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. But I chalked it up to exhaustion. Long nights on the road can mess with your mind. I finally spotted the rest stop, a small isolated parking area with a few picnic tables and a dilapidated restroom building. There was only one other vehicle there, an old beat-up pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. Its headlights were off, and there was no sign of anyone around. I pulled my rig into a space a few spots away from the pickup, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The quiet was unnerving. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind through the desert brush, and even that seemed too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I walked around to stretch my legs, keeping an eye on the pickup truck. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't figure out why. It looked like it had been there a while, dusty, with its windows rolled down slightly, but there was no movement, no sign of life. I was debating whether to even bother with a nap when I heard it, a soft thud coming from the direction of the pickup. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the sound, squinting through the dim light from my truck's headlight. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. Someone was standing next to the pickup, leaning against the driver's side door. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette, dark and motionless, staring in my direction. "Hey!" I called out, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Everything all right?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all, just stood there like a shadow cut out of the night. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the truck, to leave and forget I ever stopped here. But my curiosity got the better of me. I took a few cautious steps toward the pickup, keeping my flashlight aimed at the ground in front of me. As I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. The figure wasn't leaning against the door, it was floating, barely off the ground, like it was suspended in the air. A cold wave of fear washed over me, and I stopped dead in my track. The figure still hadn't moved, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I was frozen, unsure of what to do, when suddenly the headlights of the pickup flickered on, blinding me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The pickup was empty, the headlights dimming back into darkness. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I needed to get the hell out of there. I bolted back to my truck, jumped in, and started the engine. As I threw the rig into gear and pulled out of the rest stop, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The pickup truck's headlights flicked on again, this time with the engine roaring to life. But there was no driver, no one behind the wheel. I floored it, speeding down Route 66 faster than I'd ever driven before. The pickup's headlights stayed with me, following at an impossible speed, like it was gliding over the asphalt. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like hours, the pickup suddenly veered off the road and disappeared into the darkness. I kept driving, my heart still pounding, until I saw the lights of another town up ahead. I didn't stop until I was well within city limits, surrounded by the safety of streetlights and people. I've been back on Route 66 since then, but I've never stopped at that rest stop again. I avoid that stretch of highway entirely whenever I can. There are stories among truckers, rumors about haunted stretches of road, strange figures appearing out of nowhere, and vehicles that follow you without a driver. I used to think they were just tall tales, the kind of stories that old-timers tell to spook rookies. But after that night, I know better. Some things on the road are real. And whatever I encountered that night on Route 66, I don't ever want to see it again. The place was a ghost town. Just a couple of rusted picnic tables, an old bathroom building, and a flickering streetlight that cast eerie shadows on the ground. The air was cold, unnaturally so for early fall, and the silence was suffocating. I parked my rig, killed the engine, and stepped out into the night. As soon as my boots hit the ground, I felt it. This heavy, oppressive feeling, like something was watching me. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. Just me, the truck, and the empty road. I shrugged it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. I stretched, walked around the truck a few times, and then decided to head to the bathroom before getting back on the road. The bathroom building looked ancient, its paint peeling and windows cracked. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dingy room with 2 stalls and a sink. The lights flickered, barely illuminating the place. I hurried through my business, eager to get back to the safety of my truck. As I washed my hands, I heard a soft sobbing sound coming from one of the stalls. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone when I pulled in, and there were no other cars or trucks in the lot. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "You okay in there?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no response. Slowly I approached the stall door, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need help?" I asked, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. The stall was empty. I stumbled back, my mind racing. There was no way I'd imagined that. I'd heard the sobbing. I'd felt the presence of someone in there. I bolted out of the bathroom, my heart in my throat, and ran back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced in the side mirror. That's when I saw her. A woman standing in the doorway of the bathroom, her long dark hair hanging in front of her face, her white dress stained with something dark. She was watching me. I threw the truck into gear and sped out of there, not daring to look back. The whole way down the highway, my hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop several miles down the road. When I told the cashier about what had happened, his face went pale. "That rest stop's been closed for years," he said quietly. "They found a woman's body there back in the 80s. She was murdered, right in that bathroom. Truckers say they still see her, if you stop long enough." I never went back to that stretch of road. And I never ever stop at rest stops that seem too quiet, too empty, because sometimes they're not empty at all. I've been driving trucks for over 25 years. In that time, I've seen just about everything the open road has to offer, good and bad. But there's one story I've kept to myself for a long time, partly because I still can't explain what happened, and partly because no one would believe me even if I tried. This was one of those experiences that sticks with you, haunting you on every empty highway and dark stretch of road you pass. It all happened on a deserted highway in Arizona, just outside of Phoenix. It was a late summer night, and the desert air had cooled down enough to make the long drive bearable. I was hauling a shipment of electronics from California to Texas, which meant driving straight through some of the most isolated parts of the Southwest. The kind of place where you can go for hours without seeing another car or truck, where the only company you have is the endless stretch of asphalt in front of you and the stars above. I'd been driving for about 8 hours straight and was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion set in. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to pull over soon for a break. But I was in the middle of nowhere, and there weren't any rest stops or gas stations for miles. Just barren desert and the occasional cactus illuminated by my truck's headlight. As I approached mile marker 77, something caught my eye. A figure standing on the side of the road, thumb out like they were hitchhiking. I slowed down to get a better look. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in jeans and a faded plaid shirt, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood completely still, his thumb raised high in the air, as if he had been waiting for someone to come along for a very long time. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored him and pushed on to the next town. But something about the way he was standing, so still and calm in the middle of the night, piqued my curiosity. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man didn't move at first, just stood there as my truck idled by the side of the road. Then, slowly, he approached the passenger side door. I rolled down the window, but something about the way he moved set me on edge. His steps were too slow, too deliberate, like he was trying to figure me out. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding more nervous than I'd intended. The man nodded but didn't say a word. Up close, I could see his face more clearly, pale, almost sickly, with deep-set eyes that seemed too dark for the dim light. His expression was blank, unreadable. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "East," he replied, his voice low and flat. That was it. No specific, just east. I hesitated, but then I figured I was heading that way anyway, and I could always drop him off at the next town. I unlocked the door, and he climbed in, silently shutting it behind him. The moment he sat down, the temperature in the cab seemed to drop by several degrees. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the cool desert air seeping in, but there was something else, an unsettling presence that seemed to fill the small space. The man sat motionless, staring straight ahead, not saying a word. I merged back onto the highway, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing mile. Every so often I'd glance over at him, but he didn't move, didn't blink. He just sat there, hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the road ahead. After a few minutes, I tried to break the tension. "So, where are you coming from?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "Nowhere," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. That was a strange response. I tried again. "You got family out east?" "Not anymore." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about his answers was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The more I talked to him, the more I realized he wasn't just quiet. There was an emptiness to him, like he was just going through the motions. About 15 miles down the road, I started noticing something strange. My truck's dashboard lights began to flicker, dimming for a second before coming back on. I figured it was just an electrical issue, nothing out of the ordinary for a rig this old. But then the radio, which had been off the whole time, suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't music, though. It was static, mixed with faint voice. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like a low, distorted conversation. I turned the radio off, but the static continued, faintly buzzing through the speakers. My heart began to race. Something wasn't right. I glanced over at the hitchhiker. He was still staring straight ahead, his hands resting in his lap, but now there was something different about him. His skin looked even paler, almost translucent, and his eyes, they seemed darker, deeper, almost like they weren't there at all. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and when he did, my blood ran cold. His eyes were hollow, empty black voids where his pupils should have been. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, far too long. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt on the side of the road, tires screeching. The hitchhiker didn't flinch, didn't move. He just kept smiling, his dark eyes locked on mine. "Get out," I stammered, my hand fumbling for the door handle. The man said nothing. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to the road and opened the door, stepping out into the darkness. As soon as he was outside, the air in the cab seemed to return to normal. The static on the radio stopped, and the dashboard lights stabilized. I didn't wait for him to close the door. I slammed it shut and floored the gas pedal, speeding down the highway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. When I reached the next town, I pulled into a truck stop and parked, trying to calm myself down. I told the clerk inside what had happened, expecting him to think I was crazy. But instead, he just nodded. "You picked up the hitchhiker, didn't you?" he asked, his voice grave. My mouth went dry. "You've heard of him?" "Everyone around here has. He shows up from time to time, out by mile marker 77. People say he's been dead for decades. Truckers who pick him up, well, let's just say you're lucky you made it here in one piece." I never took that route again. And if you're ever driving through the Arizona desert late at night and you see a man standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter what. As a long-haul truck driver, I'm used to pulling long hours through the dead of night, especially across empty highways and desolate interstates. There's something peaceful about driving at night when the road is quiet, and all you have is the hum of your engine and the endless horizon ahead of you. But one night, a routine haul through rural Kansas turned into something that still chills me to this day. I was on a route from Dallas to Denver, hauling a trailer full of automotive parts. It was around 1 a.m. when I decided to pull over at a rest stop just off Route 54. The rest stop wasn't much, just a small parking lot with a couple of picnic tables and a dimly lit restroom building. There was nothing else around for miles except flat plains and a pitch-black sky. I parked the truck, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cold night air. I'd been driving for hours, and I needed to stretch my legs and use the restroom before pushing through the last leg of the trip. The silence was almost deafening. No crickets, no wind, just a thick, oppressive stillness that made me uneasy. But exhaustion outweighed my discomfort, and I made my way to the restroom. As I approached the building, I noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from one of the windows, like an old, flickering fluorescent light. It struck me as odd because the rest stop looked abandoned, like it hadn't been maintained in years. The concrete was cracked, weeds sprouted through the pavement, and the paint was peeling off the walls. But there was light coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door. The restroom smelled of mildew and dampness, and the light inside flickered erratically. I quickly took care of business and was about to leave when I heard the sound of footsteps outside. At first I thought it was another trucker pulling into the lot, but when I stepped outside, there was no one there. Just my truck and the same oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the picnic tables, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, or at least I thought it was, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1950s. He wore a fedora and a long trench coat. His back turned to me as he stood there, completely still. "Hey, you need something?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty night. The figure didn't respond. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, motionless, like a statue. I took a step closer, squinting to get a better look, but the shadows seemed to cling to him, making it impossible to see his face. My gut was screaming at me to get back in the truck and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey buddy, you okay?" I called out again, my voice trembling slightly. Still no response. I took another step forward, but the moment I did, the figure turned. His face, or what was left of it, was grotesque, sunken and twisted like it had been rotting for years. His eyes were dark hollows, and his mouth hung open in a permanent, toothless grin. My blood turned to ice as I realized I wasn't looking at a man. I was looking at something else entirely. Before I could react, the figure vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, like a wisp of smoke blown away by the wind. I didn't wait to see if he would come back. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling with the keys as I scrambled into the cab. My heart was pounding in my chest as I started the engine and threw the truck into gear, speeding out of the rest stop without looking back. I drove for miles, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty highway and the darkness. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally pulled over at a well-lit truck stop, my heart still racing. I asked the clerk inside if there were any stories about that rest stop on Route 54, but he just shook his head. "I've heard of a few people saying they've seen things out there," he said, his voice low. "Old ghosts, I guess. That rest stop's been closed for years. Had an accident back in the 60s, my family died there. Ever since then, people say they see things." I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want to know. To this day, I avoid that stretch of Route 54. And if I ever have to drive through Kansas again, I make sure to stop for the night long before I reach Dead Man's Rest Stop. It was late fall, and I had a delivery to make up in the Pacific Northwest. My route took me through some of the most remote and isolated stretches of highway I'd ever driven, winding through thick forests and mountainous terrain. It's the kind of road where cell service is spotty, and the towns are few and far between. You can go for hours without seeing another car or truck. I'd been driving since early morning, and by the time night fell, I was deep in the heart of Washington's Cascade Mountains. The road was narrow, with sharp turns and dense trees lining both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The fog had rolled in thick, making visibility difficult. My headlights barely pierced through the mist, and every shadow seemed to shift and move in the periphery of my vision. I was used to driving alone at night, but something about this stretch of road felt off. It wasn't just the isolation or the darkness. It was a feeling of being watched, like there were eyes on me from the fort. Around midnight, I spotted a small, run-down rest area up ahead, a gravel lot with a single dim streetlight and a couple of picnic tables. There wasn't another vehicle in sight, but I was tired, and the tension in my shoulders was becoming unbearable. I figured I'd pull over for a few minutes, stretch my legs, and maybe get some fresh air before continuing. I parked the truck and stepped out into the cold night air. The fog swirled around me, and the silence was almost suffocating. I leaned against the side of the truck, listening to the distant rustle of the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then I heard something else, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, straining my ears to locate the source of the noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone or something was nearby. My eyes scanned the fog, but I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The shuffling sound grew closer, and my heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response, just the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps moving close. I backed up toward the truck, my hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then I heard it, a soft thud coming from the back of the truck, like something had climbed into the bed. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The back of my truck was obscured by the fog, but I could hear something moving back there, shifting and rustling. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? My gut told me to get back in the cab and lock the doors, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and slowly made my way to the back of the truck, my pulse racing with every step. As I approached the bed, the rustling stopped, and for a second, everything was eerily still. I shone the flashlight into the back of the truck, the beam cutting through the fog. At first, I didn't see anything. The bed was empty, just the tarp covering my load. But then I noticed something strange. One of the corners of the tarp was lifted, as if something had been hiding underneath it. Cautiously, I reached out and pulled the tarp back. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, curled up in the corner of the truck bed, was a man. His clothes were filthy, torn, and caked with mud, and his skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead, but they didn't seem to focus on anything. He wasn't moving, he just lay there perfectly still, as if he were dead. But he wasn't. I could see his chest rise and fall with shallow, labored breaths. I stumbled back, dropping the tarp in my panic. "What the hell?" Before I could react, the man slowly sat up, his head tilting at an unnatural angle as he fixed his gaze on me. His eyes were empty, hollow, like he wasn't there, like he was something else entirely. I bolted back to the cab, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my heart racing as I floored the gas and sped out of the rest area. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, hours later. When I finally dared to check the back of the truck, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no footprints in the gravel, no disturbance in the tarp. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was lurking in the back of my truck that night wasn't human. I've been a trucker for over 2 decades, but this one incident has haunted me ever since. The roads can be lonely, especially on the less traveled routes, but they have a strange way of throwing unexpected things your way. This was the case one late autumn night on a stretch of Route 66, a road known for its long, deserted expanses that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. It was around 2 a.m., and I had been driving for hours. My eyes were getting heavy, but I was determined to push through until sunrise. The moon was bright that night, casting eerie shadows across the barren desert landscape. The only sound was the steady hum of my truck's engine, which, under normal circumstances, was comforting. But that night, something felt off. The road was too quiet. I hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like hours. Up ahead, I spotted a figure walking along the side of the road. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, his thumb out, hitchhiking. Now, I'm no stranger to picking up hitchhikers. I've met my fair share over the years, some grateful, some quiet, some a little odd. But I've also heard enough horror stories from fellow truckers to know that picking up strangers in the dead of night can be a gamble. Still, something about this guy felt different, almost urgent. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over a few yards ahead of him. In my rearview mirror, I watched as he jogged up to the passenger side door. He was an older man, probably in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and tired eye. He looked harmless enough, but there was a haunted look on his face that gave me pause. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he climbed into the cab. His voice was shaky, and his hands trembled as he pulled the door shut. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "Where are you headed?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just up the road a bit, as far as you can take me." I nodded and pulled back onto the highway. The man was quiet for the first few miles, staring out the window at the desolate landscape. I could feel the tension in the air, and after a while, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "So, what brings you out here in the middle of the night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him, unsure of what he meant. "A mistake," he nodded slowly. "I was out here not far from where you picked me up, walking along the road just like tonight. But I wasn't alone." He paused, and I could see his hands trembling again. I waited for him to continue. "I picked up a hitchhiker," he said finally, his voice growing more strained. "A young woman. She looked like she was in trouble, so I offered her a ride. I thought I was doing the right thing." I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke. Something about his story felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. "She was quiet at first," he continued. "Didn't say much. But then after a while, she started talking, rambling about how she needed to get away from something. I didn't ask too many questions. I figured she was just running from a bad situation." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the cab as if he were expecting something or someone to appear out of the shadows. We drove for a few hours and then she disappeared. One second she was there, sitting right beside me, and the next she was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I stared at him, my hands gripping the wheel. "What do you mean, gone?" "She just vanished?" He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I stopped the truck, got out, and looked everywhere, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had never been there at all. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to write him off as some paranoid guy with a wild imagination, but the fear in his voice was real. He believed every word of what he was saying. "I've heard stories about this stretch of road," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People say it's cursed, that hitchhikers disappear and the ones who pick them up, they're never the same." I felt a knot form in my stomach as I listened to his story. I had heard similar tales from other truckers, urban legends about haunted highways and ghostly hitchhikers. I'd never put much stock in them, but sitting next to this man, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We drove in silence for a while longer, the weight of his story hanging heavy in the air. Finally he spoke again. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low and serious. "There are things out here on these roads, things that aren't human." I didn't know how to respond to that. I just nodded and kept my eyes on the road. After a few more miles, the man asked me to pull over. I stopped the truck, and he climbed out without another word. He gave me a final, haunted look before disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a few minutes, the engine idling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man's story had rattled me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing by the side of the road, or worse, the woman he had described. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out into the night. To this day, I can't drive that stretch of Route 66 without thinking about the hitchhiker and the man's warning. I don't know if his story was real, or if he was just another lost soul haunted by his demons. But one thing is for sure. There are things on those roads that I'll never understand. I'd been hauling freight through the remote regions of Oregon for years, but this one particular night on Highway 97 stood out. It's a long, lonely stretch of road that winds through dense forests and barren fields with very few towns in between. The road is narrow, and at night, it feels like the trees are closing in on you from both sides, their branches reaching out like claws. It was mid-December, and the weather had turned bitterly cold. A light snow had started to fall, dusting the road in a thin layer of white. I had just passed through the small town of Klamath Falls and was heading north toward Bend. The clock on the dashboard read 1:45 a.m., and I still had a few hours to go before I could stop for the night. The road was completely deserted. No other vehicles, no lights, just me and the dark. The only sound was the steady rumble of my truck's engine and the occasional crunch of snow under the tires. After driving for about an hour, I noticed something strange. In my side mirror, I could see a pair of headlights in the distance, slowly gaining on me. It was odd because I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. I figured it was just another trucker, but something about the way the lights moved caught my attention. They seemed to flicker, almost like they were struggling to stay on. The headlights got closer, and soon I could see the outline of a large truck behind me. It was an old beat-up semi, the kind you don't see on the road much anymore. The paint was peeling, and the trailer looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The truck pulled up beside me, and I glanced over to get a look at the driver. But when I did, my blood ran cold. There was no one in the cab. The truck was moving alongside me, perfectly matching my speed, but the driver's seat was empty. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the snow, or the shadows, or the dim light of the dashboard. But no, there was no one there. I slowed down, hoping the truck would pass me, but it didn't. It stayed right beside me, the headlights flickering like they were about to go out at any moment. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the truck matched my speed again, never falling behind or pulling ahead. It was like it was tethered to me, refusing to let me go. Panic started to set in. I had heard stories from other truckers about phantom vehicles on the road, ghostly apparitions that appear out of nowhere and follow you for miles before vanishing. I had always dismissed them as urban legends, the kind of tales drivers tell to pass the time. But now I wasn't so sure. I glanced in my mirror again, and that's when I saw it. Something in the back of the trailer. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I realized there was something, or someone, moving inside. It was a figure, hunched and misshapen, barely visible through the frost-covered windows of the trailer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whatever was in that truck wasn't human. I could feel it in my bones. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the snowy road. The truck sped past me, its headlights flickering wildly before disappearing into the darkness. For a moment I sat there, my hands shaking, trying to catch my breath. The road was empty again, as if the truck had never been there. I didn't waste any time. I put the truck in gear and sped off, my eyes glued to the road ahead, praying that I wouldn't see those flickering headlights in my mirror again. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But every time I drive down Highway 97, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, waiting for me to pass by again. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and while I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, nothing compares to what happened one cold winter night on a lonely stretch of Interstate 80. It was late December, and the snow was coming down hard. The highway was barely visible through the blizzard, and I was beginning to feel the effects of fatigue. My destination was still several hours away, but I knew I needed a break soon. I spotted a rest stop up ahead, a small oasis in the middle of the storm. The rest stop had been a welcome sight on many long hauls, a place to stretch my legs and grab a quick bite. I pulled in, maneuvering my rig carefully through the snow-covered lot. The rest stop was nearly deserted, save for a few other trucks parked along the perimeter. The flickering lights of the rest stop sign provided the only illumination in the otherwise pitch-black night. As I climbed down from the cab, I noticed that the usual attendant booth was closed. It wasn't unusual for the booth to be unattended during off-peak hours, but it added to the eerie atmosphere of the place. I walked into the dimly lit convenience store, shaking off the snow and trying to warm up. Inside, the store was just as empty as the lot outside. I grabbed a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and sat at one of the tables near the window. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes, reducing visibility to almost zero. I could barely make out the outlines of the other trucks parked outside. While I was eating, I noticed something odd. A dark figure appeared in the window, standing near the entrance of the rest stop. The figure was shrouded in shadows, and I couldn't make out any details. I thought it might be a fellow trucker, so I decided to investigate. I walked to the door and opened it, but when I stepped outside, the figure was gone. I looked around, but the only thing I could see was the swirling snow and the parked truck. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I went back inside, finished my coffee, and prepared to leave. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed a strange sound, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere near the back of the rest stop. It was almost as if someone was banging on the wall. I stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from the area where the restrooms were located. I approached cautiously, peering around the corner, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The thumping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I decided to check it out, walking towards the restrooms. The noise was so loud now that it felt like it was vibrating through the walls. As I reached the door, the thumping abruptly stopped. I opened the door and looked inside, but the restroom was empty and silent. Feeling uneasy, I quickly left the restrooms and headed back to my truck. I got in, started the engine, and prepared to leave. Just as I was about to pull out of the lot, I noticed a truck parked directly in front of me, its engine running and lights off. The truck was old and battered, not the kind you see often. I tried to ignore it and began backing up, but the truck remained in my way. I honked the horn, but there was no response. I got out of my truck to see if someone was inside, but the driver's seat was empty. The truck was running, but there was no sign of anyone. Just then, the lights of the truck flickered on, and I saw the figure from earlier, standing on the opposite side of the truck, staring directly at me. My heart raced as I jumped back into my truck and slammed the door shut. I put the rig in gear and drove away as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The rest stop faded into the distance, and the snowstorm seemed to swallow the rest of the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me the entire time. I haven't stopped at that rest stop since, and I always make sure to keep my windows up and doors locked whenever I'm parked overnight. I was driving through the Appalachians, a long haul from Charleston to Richmond, when I encountered something that still chills me to this day. It was a late October night, and the weather was unusually foggy. The fog was thick, clinging to the mountains and making visibility incredibly poor. Around midnight, I approached a toll booth that I didn't remember from previous trips. The toll booths on this route were usually closed during the late hours, but this one was lit up and seemed to be operational. I slowed down and pulled up to the booth, wondering why they would have it open at this hour. The booth itself looked old-fashioned, with a rusty metal frame and flickering lights. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a worn face and a deep scar across his cheek, greeted me with a nod. He didn't say a word, just held out his hand for the toll. I fished out a few dollars and handed them over. The attendant took the money without a word, then pointed to a small window where I could see the faint outline of a road ahead, obscured by fog. I took the toll receipt and continued on my way, feeling uneasy about the interaction, but attributing it to the late hour. The fog was so dense that I had to drive slowly, my high beams barely cutting through the murk. After about 20 minutes, I saw something strange in the distance. It was a large, dilapidated building illuminated by a single flickering light. It looked like an old inn, or perhaps a long-abandoned warehouse. As I approached, I noticed the building wasn't on any map I had, nor was there any mention of it on my GPS. It seemed out of place, almost as if it had materialized out of the fog. I considered stopping to check it out, but something about the place felt wrong. I continued driving, but the fog grew even thicker, and I soon found myself disoriented. The road seemed to twist and turn unpredictably, and I had to focus intently to stay on course. After what felt like hours, I saw another toll booth up ahead, this one even more rundown than the first. I pulled up to the booth, expecting to see the same attendant, but instead, there was no one there. The booth was empty, and the light above the window was flickering erratically. I honked my horn, but there was no response. I looked around, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. Feeling uneasy, I decided to move on. Just as I was about to drive away, I saw a shadowy figure emerge from the fog, standing near the toll booth. It was a tall, gaunt man, his face obscured by the fog. He stared at me with hollow eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed up quickly, my truck's tires skidding on the wet pavement. The figure seemed to move with the fog, never quite coming into full view. I sped off, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As I drove through the fog, I noticed the landscape changing. The road began to twist and turn in ways that felt unnatural. It was as if I was driving in circles, unable to find my way out. The fog seemed to close in around me, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. Eventually, I saw a light in the distance, an exit ramp that led to a small, unfamiliar town. I took the exit, desperate for a place to rest. The town was eerily quiet, with no signs of life or activity. I found a small diner that was open and stopped to regroup. The waitress at the diner seemed surprised to see me. She mentioned that the road I had been on had been closed for years, and the toll booths had been abandoned. According to her, the fog that night had been particularly strange, and there were rumors of ghostly apparitions on that stretch of road. I left the diner as soon as I could, heading back to familiar territory. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why the road was so twisted and disoriented, but I learned never to take unfamiliar routes in dense fog, and always to be cautious of those seemingly abandoned toll booths. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've traveled just about every major highway in the country. But there's one stretch of road that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It was a crisp autumn night, and I was hauling a load from Denver to Chicago, taking the old Route 66 for a change of pace. The road was quieter than usual, with hardly any traffic. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. I was about halfway through my journey when I decided to pull over at a small, isolated rest area. The place was old and rundown, with a couple of broken benches and a dilapidated restroom building. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it had a small, flickering light that provided just enough illumination. I parked my rig and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The rest area was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I walked over to the restroom to use the facilities, but as I approached, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, and there were strange scratches on the floor leading into the building. I pushed the door open and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response, only the faint echo of my voice. I quickly used the restroom and headed back to my truck, feeling uneasy. As I was getting back into my cab, I noticed a strange figure standing near the edge of the rest area. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that seemed out of place for the modern world. He was standing still, staring blankly into the distance. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but something about him felt wrong. I approached cautiously and called out, "Hey, are you all right? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move or respond. As I got closer, I realized that he was standing right by the edge of a steep drop-off, which led down into a ravine. Suddenly, the figure turned his head and looked directly at me. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The figure began to move towards me slowly, and I could hear faint whispers carried on the wind. I didn't stick around to find out more. I rushed back to my truck, started the engine, and drove off as quickly as I could. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I did some research about that stretch of Route 66 and discovered that the rest area had been the site of a tragic accident many years ago. A truck had plunged off the edge of the ravine, killing the driver instantly. It was said that the driver's ghost still wandered the area, searching for help. To this day, I avoid that rest area and any similar isolated spots on my routes. I'm not superstitious, but I can't ignore the feeling that I encountered something otherworldly that night. I had been driving long hauls for a few years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But one night, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a sweltering August evening, and I was driving from Nashville to New Orleans with a planned stop at a truck stop I'd never been to before. The truck stop was located off a small rural highway, surrounded by dense woods. As I pulled in, I noticed that the place was unusually quiet. The parking lot was almost empty, and the lights were dim. I parked my rig and went inside to grab some food and a drink. The interior of the truck stop was old-fashioned and seemed to have been untouched for decades. The walls were adorned with dusty old memorabilia, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee. The clerk behind the counter was a grizzled old man with a weathered face. He barely looked up from his newspaper as I walked in. I grabbed a sandwich and a soda, and when I went to pay, the clerk gave me a strange look. "You sure you want to be here at this hour?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I shrugged it off and paid for my food. "Just need a quick break before getting back on the road," I said. The clerk nodded, but his expression remained unsettlingly serious. "Well, just be careful. This place has a reputation." I was curious but didn't press further. I thanked him and headed back to my truck. As I was finishing my sandwich, I noticed a series of odd events. The lights in the truck stop flickered intermittently, and I heard strange noises coming from the surrounding woods, distant voices and what sounded like heavy footsteps. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be a prank or some kind of animal. I walked around the perimeter of the truck stop, shining my flashlight into the woods. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I was about to head back when I noticed a figure standing in the shadows between the trees. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked out of place with the modern setting of the truck stop. He was standing still, staring directly at me. I called out, but he didn't move or respond. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to return to my truck. As I walked back, I heard the sound of footsteps following me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps seemed to stop whenever I looked back. I hurried into my truck and locked the doors. I started the engine and prepared to leave, but just as I was about to drive off, the old man from the truck stop appeared at the edge of the lot. He was holding a lantern, and his face was now illuminated by its flickering light. He looked even more unnerving in the darkness. I rolled down my window slightly and asked, "Is everything all right?" The old man didn't answer, but instead pointed towards the woods. I glanced in that direction and saw several figures emerging from the shadows. Ghostly apparitions of people in old-fashioned clothing, wandering. Panic set in. I quickly drove out of the truck stop, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the figures and the old man had vanished. I never returned to that truck stop, and I always make sure to stick to well-lit, busy stops from now on. The experience left me with a lingering sense of dread, and I can't shake the feeling that I stumbled upon something that was better left undisturbed. I've been driving trucks for over a decade, and while the job can be monotonous, it has its moments of unexpected excitement. But nothing prepared me for what happened on a chilly November night when I was hauling a load from Kansas City to Denver. The night was clear and the stars were bright, but the temperature was dropping fast. I was cruising along Interstate 70, making good time, when I saw a small flickering light in the distance. It looked like a truck's headlights, but the truck wasn't moving. I figured it was a trucker taking a break, so I slowed down as I approached. As I got closer, I realized the truck was parked on the side of the road, its engine off and lights dimmed. The truck was old and battered, looking like it hadn't seen a road in years. Its trailer was covered in rust and the paint was peeling. I thought it was strange for such an old rig to be on the highway, but I shrugged it off and continued driving. A few miles down the road, I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. A set of headlights appeared behind me, but they were moving strangely, as if they were swerving. I checked my mirrors and saw the old truck that had been parked earlier, now tailgating me. It was as if it had vanished from the side of the road and reappeared right behind me. I hit the brakes to let the truck pass, but it stayed right on my tail. The headlights were blinding, and I could see nothing but their glaring intensity. I increased my speed, but the truck matched my pace, staying close behind. A wave of anxiety washed over me. I tried flashing my lights to signal the truck to back off, but it didn't work. The truck continued its relentless pursuit, and I could feel the tension mounting. I decided to pull over and see what was going on. I found a small pull-off area and parked, hoping the truck would pass by. But as soon as I stopped, the headlights disappeared. I waited for a few minutes, my heart pounding, before getting out to check. The area was deserted, and there was no sign of the old truck. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I got back in my rig, feeling uneasy but relieved to be alone. I continued my journey, but the eerie feeling lingered. Later that night, I found a truck stop and decided to rest. When I walked inside, I overheard a conversation between a few truckers about a phantom truck that haunted the stretch of Interstate 70 I had just driven. According to the story, a trucker in the 1970s had vanished without a trace while driving that route. His truck was found abandoned on the side of the road, and no trace of him was ever discovered. It was said that his ghost now roamed the highway, chasing down unsuspecting drivers. I'm not one to believe in ghost stories, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come face to face with something otherworldly. I always take extra precautions now, especially when driving alone on remote stretches of highway. I've never seen that phantom truck again, but the memory of those blinding headlights still haunts me. I had just finished a long shift and was driving back home after delivering a load from Houston to Dallas. It was a typical night, with only a few other trucks on the road. I was looking forward to getting home and resting, but fate had other plans for me. Around midnight, I noticed a way station up ahead. It was closed, but its lights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the area. I wasn't due for a weigh-in, but something about the place made me curious. I decided to pull in and take a break, thinking it might be a good spot to stretch my legs. As I parked my rig, I noticed that the way station was old and run down. The building was dilapidated, with broken windows and peeling paint. The lot was littered with debris, and the whole place had an air of abandonment. Still, I figured it would be a good place to get some fresh air. I got out of the truck and walked towards the building. The wind howled through the empty lot, and the only sound was the creaking of the old structure. As I approached the door, I saw a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The sign was barely legible, and it looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to check it out. I pushed open the door, which groaned on its hinges. Inside, the building was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the only source of light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. I walked through the lobby, which was filled with old paperwork and rusty office equipment. It was clear that the place had been abandoned for a long time. I was about to leave when I heard a noise, a faint tapping coming from the back of the building. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound. It led me to a small office at the rear of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was louder now, like someone or something was knocking from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped into the office. The room was cluttered with old filing cabinets and dusty furniture. The tapping noise was coming from an old, rusty safe in the corner. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the rusted surface. Just as I was about to investigate further, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it back on, but the safe was now slightly open, as if someone had been trying to pry it open. A cold chill ran down my spine as I noticed that the tapping noise had stopped. I felt a presence in the room, as if someone or something was watching me. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and turned to leave. As I exited the building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were strange, faded footprints leading from the office to the parking lot, as if someone had walked through the dust and left an eerie trail. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the lot. I got back into my truck and drove away as fast as I could, my nerves on edge. I never stopped at that way station again, and I always avoid abandoned places when I'm on the road. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced that night, but the memory of those strange footprints and the unsettling presence in that old building still haunts me. I've been driving trucks across the country for over 15 years, and I've had my fair share of strange experiences. But there's one story that stands out more than the rest. It happened one quiet, chilly night in the middle of nowhere when I was driving a long haul from Albuquerque to Phoenix. It was a clear night, with a nearly full moon casting long shadows on the highway. I was about halfway through my route when I noticed a small, dilapidated truck stop up ahead. I wasn't planning to stop, but I was feeling a bit weary and thought it might be a good idea to take a quick break. I pulled into the truck stop, which looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The building was old and worn, with flickering lights and a few broken windows. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few other trucks scattered around. As I walked inside, I noticed the place had a certain eerie feel to it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air was filled with the smell of old coffee and dust. I approached the counter, where a young woman with dark circles under her eyes was working. "Evening," I said, trying to be friendly. "Just stopping in for a quick break." The woman nodded but didn't say much. She handed me a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and I took a seat at one of the tables. The truck stop was quiet, with only the occasional sound of the air conditioning unit cycling on and off. As I sat there, I noticed an old, outdated payphone in the corner of the room. It had a faded sign above it that read, "For dispatch calls only." I thought it was odd, but I didn't give it much thought until I saw the young woman walk over to the payphone and pick up the receiver. She held the receiver to her ear for a moment before turning to me. "Are you the driver for truck number 4827? I was taken aback. Yeah, that's me." "Why?" The woman looked confused. "I don't know. I just got a call asking for you. They said it was urgent." I was puzzled. I hadn't received any calls or messages on my radio. "From who?" She shrugged and shook her head. "I didn't catch a name, just that they needed to get in touch with you." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't had any issues with my load or my route, so I couldn't imagine who would need to contact me in such a manner. I decided to check in with my dispatcher to see if there was any issue. I went back to my truck and tried to reach my dispatcher over the radio, but I couldn't get a signal. I thought it might be a temporary issue, so I started the engine and drove to a nearby area with better reception. As soon as I found a spot with a clearer signal, I tried contacting my dispatcher again. When I finally reached them, my dispatcher seemed perplexed. "We haven't made any calls or messages tonight," they said. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" I insisted that I had received a call, and they assured me that everything was fine on their end. I decided to return to the truck stop, thinking I might have just misheard or misunderstood the situation. When I arrived back at the truck stop, the young woman at the counter was gone. The place seemed even eerier than before, and the lights flickered more than usual. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but nothing seemed to add up. I decided to spend the night at the truck stop, hoping to clear my mind and get some rest. As I settled into my truck, I heard strange noises coming from outside, distant voices and the sound of footsteps. But when I looked outside, there was no one around. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Throughout the night, I kept hearing the payphone ringing intermittently, though I knew no one was supposed to be around. In the morning, I found out that the truck stop had been closed for years and had recently been reopened by someone who was running it alone. The young woman I had seen was nowhere to be found, and the payphone was disconnected. It was as if the whole place had been stuck in a time warp. I never stopped at that truck stop again, and I always make sure to verify any communications or messages I receive on the road. To this day, I still think about that strange encounter and the mysterious call that never should have been made. The eerie atmosphere of that truck stop and the phantom dispatcher's call remains a chilling reminder of the unknown. I've been driving trucks for years, and the job has taken me to all kinds of places, from bustling cities to remote stretches of highway. But one night stands out in my memory more than the rest. It was a dark, stormy evening, and I was hauling a load from Atlanta to Charlotte. The weather was rough, with heavy rain and strong winds making visibility poor. As I drove through the night, I noticed that my GPS was acting up, constantly recalculating and giving me different directions. It wasn't unusual for the weather to interfere with signal reception, so I wasn't too concerned. I relied on the road signs and my knowledge to navigate. Around midnight, the GPS suddenly displayed a detour route. I was hesitant to take it, but the signs on the road indicated that the highway ahead was closed due to an accident. I had no choice but to follow the detour. The detour took me onto a narrow, winding road that seemed to cut through dense woods. The rain continued to pour, and the road was slippery and treacherous. I drove slowly, trying to stay alert. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, and the darkness was almost oppressive. As I drove further, I saw a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a small, old-fashioned lamp or lantern. I figured it might be a farmhouse or some kind of roadside establishment, so I slowed down to investigate. I turned onto a small, gravel driveway that led to a weathered wooden building. The structure was old and appeared abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. A faint light glowed from inside, casting long shadows on the ground. I parked my truck and decided to check it out. As I approached the building, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. I called out, but there was no response. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The interior of the building was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Dust and cobwebs covered the furniture, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The light source was a single, flickering lantern sitting on an old wooden table. The room was otherwise empty. I explored the building, finding old, faded photographs on the walls and a dusty ledger on a desk. The ledger was filled with strange entries, like a log of people who had come and gone. The names and dates were odd and seemed to be from a different era. As I was about to leave, I heard a noise coming from the back of the building, a faint shuffling sound. I called out again, but there was no answer. The sound grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided it was best to leave and get back on the road. I turned to leave, but the door to the building suddenly slammed shut, trapping me inside. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. The lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, casting a beam of light around the room. The shuffling sound was now accompanied by eerie whispers, and I could see shadows moving on the walls. I heard footsteps approaching, and the whispers grew louder. I felt a presence in the room, as if someone or something was watching me. I backed away from the door and looked around for another exit, but the building was old and decrepit, with no obvious escape routes. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out fragments of words like lost and forever. I felt a cold breeze, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop significantly. The shadows on the walls began to take on eerie shapes, and I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly opened on its own, and the light from outside flooded the room. I dashed out, not looking back, and got back to my truck as quickly as I could. I drove away from the abandoned building, my heart racing. The rain continued to pour, and the road was still treacherous, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally reached my destination in Charlotte, exhausted and shaken. I couldn't find any information about the building or its history, and the detour route was nowhere to be found on any map. I learned to always double-check my route and avoid unfamiliar detours. The memory of that eerie building and the unsettling whispers still haunts me. I can't explain what I experienced that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never take another detour without knowing exactly where I'm going. It was a regular Friday night when I set out on my usual cross-country route from Denver to Chicago. I had a heavy load of machinery in the back, and I was eager to get to my destination so I could unwind for the weekend. The road stretched out before me, and I had a clear sky and a full tank of gas. Everything seemed normal until I encountered something that would haunt me for years. Around midnight, I was driving through a desolate stretch of highway. There were no other trucks or cars in sight, just miles of empty road flanked by dark forests. I was starting to feel a bit drowsy when I spotted a figure standing by the side of the road. The figure was a man in a tattered coat, his thumb extended in the universal sign of hitchhiking. I was wary about picking up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere, but something about the man's appearance made me feel uneasy. He looked like he had been out there for a while, and his clothes were dirty and torn. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, and he seemed to be shivering in the cold night air. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over and offer him a ride. I rolled down the window and asked him where he was headed. The man's voice was rough and gravelly, and he mumbled something about needing to get to the nearest town. I didn't catch all of his words, but I could tell he was desperate. I opened the door, and the man climbed into the passenger seat. As soon as he was inside, the temperature in the cab seemed to drop. I turned on the heater, but it didn't make much difference. The man didn't say much and just stared out the window, his face hidden in the shadows of his hat. I tried to make small talk to lighten the mood, but the man's responses were short and disjointed. I began to feel uneasy, sensing that something was off. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the only sound was the rumble of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. As we drove, I noticed that the man's presence seemed to cast a strange, oppressive atmosphere in the cab. The radio, which had been playing softly, started to crackle and emit strange static noises. I glanced over at the man, but he was still staring out the window, seemingly oblivious to the changing conditions. Suddenly, the man spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what's waiting for you up ahead?" I was taken aback by his words. "What do you mean?" The man didn't respond immediately. He just continued to stare out the window, his face still obscured. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we continued driving, the road began to wind through a dense forest. The trees were tall and dark, and the shadows seemed to stretch out across the road. The headlights of my truck cast eerie patterns on the trees, making the whole scene look surreal. I decided to break the silence and ask the man if he knew anything about the area. He finally turned to face me, and I was shocked by what I saw. His face was gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, and his skin was sallow. "I wouldn't go any further if I were you," he said softly. "There are things out here that you don't want to see." I was unnerved by his words and glanced nervously at the road ahead. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the darkness felt almost suffocating. I considered turning back, but I had already committed to this route and didn't want to get lost. Just then, the headlights illuminated a small, rundown gas station in the distance. It looked abandoned, with flickering lights and a dilapidated building. I decided it would be a good place to stop and stretch my legs, and maybe get some answers from the man. I pulled into the gas station, which was eerily quiet. The pumps were old and rusted, and the entire place had an air of decay. The man got out of the truck without a word and walked towards the building. I followed him, feeling a sense of foreboding. As we approached the building, I noticed something strange. The windows were covered in grime, and the door was slightly ajar. The man walked inside without hesitation, but I hesitated at the threshold. I could feel a strong, unsettling presence inside. I took a deep breath and followed him in. The interior was dark and dusty, with old newspapers and cobwebs covering the floor. There was an old counter with a cash register, but it was empty and untouched. The man was nowhere to be seen. I called out, but there was no response. I felt a growing sense of dread and decided to leave the gas station. As I turned to go, I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, standing still and watching me. The figure was indistinct, but I could feel its gaze. I quickly left the gas station and returned to my truck. When I looked in the passenger seat, the man was gone. The door was closed, and there was no sign of him. I felt a mixture of relief and fear, and I couldn't explain what had happened. I got back on the road and continued my journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rest of the drive was tense, and I was relieved when I finally reached my destination in Chicago. I never picked up another hitchhiker after that night, and I always avoid driving through desolate areas. The memory of the mysterious hitchhiker and the unsettling gas station remains a haunting reminder of the unknown dangers that lurk on the open road.